Right, I'm guessing you all heard that. So, where do we begin? Well, if you look at one of the classic Tibetan mandalas, which I'm hoping you've all seen one somewhere, they're pretty common. Even something like the Wheel of Life is a mandala. They seem to be very decorative. They seem to be two-dimensional. It's generally speaking, they're shown as a picture, two-dimensional picture. There tends to be a figure or sometimes a symbol in the middle. And there's all sorts of other figures and designs going out from that center towards some kind of periphery, which is usually a circle, though the circle often has a square in it. And that depiction is kind of the plan view, in a sense, of a building, really, or a city. So that's how we normally see them. It's probably worth looking at, well, what is actually happening in a mandala? And if any of you have done any sadhana practice, I haven't done a lot of sadhana practice myself, but if you've done any sadhana practice, you'll be familiar with this. Because actually, what are we seeing when we see this? Well, for a start, we're seeing something which is flat, but is meant to be three-dimensional. And you can see three-dimensional depictions. Choi and I saw some in both Bhutan and Sikkim, where there's this wonderful palace built up with a circle around the outside of it, and the palace goes up and up in various stages. And at the top, which will be the center of the flat view, there is the deity or central point of that mandala. So that's one way of depicting them, and we'll come back to that. But actually, what we're seeing in a mandala is a world that's been manifested, created from the heart of the central Buddha within it. So we say Buddha, it could be a symbol, it could be anything. But from that, this world is made manifest. Now, if you take the traditional Tibetan Wheel of Life, what you've got in the center of that is avidya. You've got delusion. And that manifests its way through the 6 realms and so on, as you can see. But in most mandalas, what you've got is, let's say a Buddha. Let's say a Buddha. From the heart of that Buddha, the whole world is made manifest. And in terms of Buddhas, these worlds are often pure lands. So the Buddha manifests a pure land. This is the traditional teaching. And one works with that in ways of creating that in one's own awareness as a sadhana practice. In sadhana practice, one identifies with that central body. In other sadhana practices, one comes into relationship with that central figure and is within that mandala. But here's the thought. And it's this thought or principle which really lies behind everything we're going to do. And that thought is, we are all Buddhas. We are all Buddhas. We may not exactly be aware of it, but we're all Buddhas. And so we all have that same capacity to manifest a world. We all create a world. In fact, we create multiple worlds. That's not too difficult to see. And we'll play with this in a bit. So what are we creating a world from? Well, we create a world from our own heart, if you like. In a sense, from our own Buddha nature. But there are other ways in which we create worlds as well. We're constantly doing it. I'm guessing all of you, I can't see you anymore, which is funny for me. But I guess we're all meditators. And if you're a meditator, just in meditation, here you are, sitting hopefully, doing your practice. And of course, what happens is thoughts, feelings, sensations emerge. And it's very often the word, we talk about in meditation, working with thought. And we'll look at that in a bit as well. But personally, about you, I have never experienced, or very rarely experienced, actually working with a thought. A thought arrives with its own world. That thought creates a world of associations. And sometimes in my meditation, if I remain centered and meditating, then I see that happen. I see that world manifest apparently, and then it disappears and another one appears and another one appears and another one appears and several appear together. Like I've got a cramp in my foot, I'm talking to you, I can see my own, worlds of association. But of course, what happens, I guess, to all of us fairly frequently is it is not only that this world appears, but somehow we get drawn into it. And then that world becomes our world of perception. So that world then becomes our world of perception. Put simply, if I'm feeling miserable, generally speaking, my miserableness is projected out into the world and everything looks miserable. Often rather than the other way around. If it's a rainy, miserable day, well, that can be nice, But the thought, disappointment, rainy, miserable day was going to go out, etc., that thought manifests in my consciousness and then creates the world that I see to a large extent. So again, that faculty that we described as Buddhas as having, we have. We're very, very creative. We are constantly creating and recreating our world. Which is a wonderful thing to be able to do. It's just quite often, as we'll see, that power of creation doesn't seem to be something we hold with awareness and which we're able to work with. It feels rather that it's working with us. If that makes any sense to you. So here's a little exercise. And we'll do this little exercise and then I'll stop recording and we can have a quick conversation about it. So if you'd like to sort of get comfortable, this is only going to take a moment. close your eyes, and I invite you to imagine a still pool, a very still pool. And then I invite you to imagine a single raindrop falling into that still pool. And just to observe what happens in the pool. When the raindrop drops into it. She's back, that woman. So we've talked a bit about center, and it must be clear by now that the center is what gives the mandala its particular quality. And we spent some time before the break there talking about, if you like, the ultimate mandalas as seen in Vidya, if you like. But we're going to keep ourselves maybe to our more everyday experience. Not that that isn't our everyday experience, but let's leave that for a moment. So I always think the image that always comes to my mind around this is of a kaleidoscope. If, from my own experience, if a certain thing is at the center and running my show, if you like, maybe I'm angry. Anger is running my show. I look at the pattern made by the anger kaleidoscope and it looks in a certain way. And then perhaps I realize that my anger is rather foolish, which it often is. Or I was mistaken in the thing that I was angry about. And somehow, it's as if the kaleidoscope gets a twist. Something else arises as the center point of the mandala. Now, the interesting thing, and you get a different pattern. So the pattern has changed now. The interesting thing about the kaleidoscope, of course, is it's always the same bits of glass. The patterns are about our perception of them, how we order them, how we organize them, what's close to us, what's further away, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And that will vary according to what's at the center of the mandala. Now, I meant to say earlier that there are two ways you can kind of approach this. One, which is quite useful, is to regard all of this as a model, like another model of experience, like, I don't know, whatever ones you've got. There are a lot about. So as a map, you can overlay on your experience to make sense of it. And that's quite useful. But that's not really how it comes into being. This whole way of seeing, which is what it is, it's a way of seeing, came into being because of the experience of meditators, or rather was articulated by them relating their experience. I find that a more useful way to come to it. But if that's a bridge too far, that's fine. Treat it as a map or a model with certain qualities. So we have our central principle. We have our center of the mandala. I get up in the morning, I'm feeling good. The day looks this way. I'm getting up in the morning, I'm not feeling good. It looks this way. I've got a pain in my foot. The world becomes totally one of pain and irritation, maybe. Depends how I relate to it. Maybe not. I'm about to meet someone I like. The world looks a certain way. I'm about to meet in the same cafe on the same day, in the same circumstances, someone I like less, or I'm not looking forward to seeing. Same environment, looks different. We can play with that a little bit. Before we do, actually, probably best to say something else. We've looked at this as so far, and we'll go back in a moment again to look at it in this way, but we've been looking at it as something about our internal perception, which it is. But I think it's pretty obvious if you look at those things which we'd normally regard as being outsiders, they can share or do share a similar structure. So, for example, a group of people has a certain central principle which holds it together. It's not necessarily the one they say it is. I mean, my experience is that groups are held together by what is not talked about rather than what is. And that's particularly true in a lot of families, for example. And we've all had the experience, probably as adults, of going back to our childhood home, maybe with our siblings, and to our parents, or parent, or whatever the dynamic is. And about you, certainly I noticed myself, this hasn't happened to me for a good many years, but I noticed myself, I would change. And I would change in relation to some unseen principle, unacknowledged, unconscious principle about how we all relate in this environment. This is how we do it. As a family, this is how we are. There are all sorts of ways of looking at that. A classic one might be, you never upset mother. It's a rule. Nobody tells you it's a rule very often. We all grew up with that. We all take that for granted. In that family mandala, that is the predominating central principle. Now, of course, if I come in with my mandala and my mandala refuses to accept that, there are going to be issues, and we'll talk about that sort of thing later. So you can look at it in terms of social structures. You can look at it in terms of organizations. You can look at it in terms of Buddha lands. You can look at it in terms of anything, really. What's the central principle of a flower? How does it manifest itself in these various ways? Does it change? But it's best done, I think, anyway. I mean, it's up to you, but I think not in an analytical way, but rather as a response, as we did with the drop. If we pop the drop into the water, what happens next? If I notice a mandala, what happens? How does it change the way I see? How does it change the way I experience? So that's central principle. It creates the nature of the mandala. All sorts of things can happen after that, which we'll look at later. But here's a little exercise to try very simply, though judging by the last simple little exercise we did, anything might happen in the next 2 minutes. So I'm going to say a word, and I'd just like you to notice what happens in your awareness when I say this word. And the word is dog. So let's stop recording and see what happened then.